Well, welcome YouTube to my channel. It has been a little bit of a while, been a bit, as they might say, been a minute. So if you are new to the channel, let me introduce myself. My name is Miles. I'm a pastor at a church in North San Diego County, California. During the time of all the chaos of the COVID shutdowns, I would fairly regularly post videos here on YouTube. In fact, almost daily for quite a while, actually like a year almost, posting content here on YouTube. But then the world got busy again. During the shutdowns, things weren't so busy, so it was easy for me to write and produce and edit, post content 5 days a week. I won't say it was easy, but it was easier than when things picked back up and we were back into normal routines. So since that time, I haven't been putting much here on YouTube and would like to get back into it. But again, producing content, writing it, producing it, editing it, posting it takes a lot of time. So that's difficult. However, going live like this is not as difficult, doesn't require as much work, as much forethought. So it is possible that I will be coming back doing some live content here on YouTube. I have everything set up here for it. Makes it relatively easy to do so. So maybe I'll come on and do some, as they say, AMAs, ask me anything, Q&As, question and answer. I've done that a few times, filling in for my friend David Guzik on his channel at Enduring Word. So some of you are subscribed to me and you're subscribed to him as well. So you've seen me on there before. But I thought I might come on here and post something today because I was at a conference, one of the families of churches that we are connected with. I pastor a church called Cross Connection Church in North San Diego County in a town called Escondido. And we're connected with a number of different groups. But I was at a conference for a group of churches yesterday. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday afternoon. And he had done, a couple days ago at this conference, he had done a workshop at the conference on the topic of deconstruction. So he's been doing a lot of different study on the topic of deconstruction. And so I figured I would give him a hypothesis of mine and ask him what he thought about it as it related to this topic of deconstruction. Now, in talking about the topic of deconstruction, it kind of brings up, well, what is that anyway? Maybe you've seen some videos on YouTube where people are going through kind of their deconstruction story. You could almost, when I was growing up in a Christian church, the church that I now pastor, Christians were oftentimes encouraged to have what they would call a testimony. You would share your conversion story, how you became a Christian. I always felt kind of funny giving my testimony because I grew up in the church and it's not like I had any sort of amazing testimony, but you were encouraged to be able to share with someone, what your life was before you were a Christian and how you became a Christian and how your life has changed after you become a Christian. It's, your basic testimony. Now there are people giving their deconstruction testimonies. They put them on Instagram, they put them on YouTube, they do them wherever and share with people about how they lost their faith. And that basically is kind of what deconstruction is. The whole Christian deconstruction movement or people deconstructing their faith is this kind of testimony phenomena among Christians where they are sharing about how either they lost their faith or they have rethought their faith or they are kind of examining their faith or belief systems. Sometimes I guess that could result in a stronger faith. More often than not, it is how they lost their faith or they left the faith. And so there are different kinds of deconstruction. And, this is not new in one sense. I mean, the end of faith for people is kind of been a thing that happens from time to time. People may have called it in another time, losing their religion, losing the religion of their faith, losing their parents' religion. And so these things have been around for a while. It's just now the thing that people call it is deconstruction. So I was talking with this friend at this conference and I said, hey, can I bounce a hypothesis off of you that I have as you've been studying this whole topic of deconstruction? And I said, I think that there are kind of like two parallel tracks of deconstruction that I have observed. The first of these two parallel tracks of deconstruction is not really all that unusual in a sense. It is the deconstruction where a person grew up in the faith, shall we say, they grew up going to church. They had what some might call, a Christian worldview as they were growing up in the faith. And their parents raised them. Maybe they even went to a private school, but they grew up going to youth group, all these different things. And then they graduated from high school, primary, secondary school, and they went on to university, or they went on to start a career, whatever it may be. They got out from underneath the normal routines of their parents' household, the rules of their parents' household. They were no longer going to church. And in the process of that, they began to walk away from their parents' faith. And, they no longer had the rules and requirements of their parents, so they started to stand upon their own as an adult. And in the process, they looked at the things that were before them and they decided, I don't want to live according to the rules of this Christian faith that was given to me. I don't know that I necessarily believe in these things. And so they begin to be affected by the worldview of the culture around them, their friends, the people that they work with. And so they begin to reject, if you will, their former faith or the worldview that they had or were raised in. Now, this rejection is really a choice to reject it, not on the basis of a real evaluation of the views they were taught in the past, or even really a real evaluation of the new views that they are beginning to hold. They choose to reject the faith primarily because they want to live according to a certain way, or the way that they were encouraged or taught to live within the church or within the home of their parents. It conflicts with their, desires for how they want to live. Now, that's, one way of losing their faith. They kind of deconstruct. And normally it's because they have been affected by a progressive and lenient culture around them, which is pretty typical. I mean, I live in Southern California. This is a pretty post-Christian environment and, very blue state environment. Even if San Diego County has traditionally been a little bit more of a red county, shall we say, it's still pretty blue state, post-Christian. So they are affected, infected by the cultural worldview around them. And so they say, I'm more like the worldview in which I live, the culture in which I live. And so it doesn't fit with my, the Christian faith doesn't fit with how I would like to live. So that's fine. So they kind of lose their faith without any real, as I said, looking into or evaluation of the old view and the new view. And so, that's one kind of way that people deconstruct or lose their faith. So I have some thoughts about that, obviously. And my advice to that person as they deconstruct a faith that really isn't like a real strong faith in the first place, I would encourage that person to recognize that they probably never fully understood the true Christian faith all that well in the first place. So as they are deconstructing faith, they're deconstructing the religion that they grew up in or the religion of their parents. They didn't really know that religion all that well intellectually. They really did not hold on to it all that strongly. Now, that may have been due to a number of different factors. Maybe the factor was that they had not the greatest example in their parents. Their parents were Christians, but kind of in name only and didn't really live out their faith. Or maybe they were kind of casual Christians. They didn't really commit to going to church. They went to church occasionally and they kind of believed these things, but they didn't really live those things out. So it could be that the faith that you grew up in or grew up with was not all that strong in the first place. It wasn't strong because your parents had not the strongest faith. Maybe you didn't go to a super great church that gave you a real firm foundation of what you believe and why you believe it. It was a lack of understanding of the faith. You never really deeply examined it yourself. And so it's really, you kind of held it with an open hand. It's not like you had a real tight grip on it in the first place. So losing your faith was not all that big of a deal because it's like, I don't even know where I put it. It's like you lose your wallet or your keys. So you can't really call that like a real firm deconstruction. It's just kind of a loss of faith because you never really grasped it in the first place. There's all kinds of different reasons why that could have happened. But my counsel to that person as they're contemplating letting go of the faith of their parents or of their upbringing and deconstructing these things is that you should, at the very least, honestly assess the truth of Christianity, and you should honestly assess the new worldview, the new path that you are embarking upon, that you would have a good reason for the things you don't believe and the things you do believe. This is what Christians would refer to as an apologetic, that you would have a good apologetic, a good defense. That comes from a passage of scripture in the New Testament in one of the Apostle Peter's letters, where he exhorts Christians that they would sanctify the Lord God in their hearts and always be ready to give a defense, an apologia for the beliefs that they have, the hope that they have within them, with gentleness and fear. So if you're going to reject the faith of Christianity and lay hold of another worldview or faith, you should have a reasoned defense for why on both sides, why you reject one, why you lay hold of another. There should be an honest assessment of the old view, the new worldview path that you're going on. I think there also you should consider where these things lead. If you're going to set out on a new path, you're going to embark on a new path, giving up the old path, you should consider where that path ultimately leads. Because right now, when you're just starting out, it might look interesting, it might look great, but you have no idea where this carries you. Where does this worldview, this mindset, this path that you're going to embark upon, where does it ultimately take you? That's an important question to answer. And I think a lot of people don't do that. And in doing that, you should consider the people who I know who have gone down this path already, and maybe they're 10 years or 30 years down that path. Where did their life go? That's a worthy consideration. But I would also say to the person who is losing their faith that they held with a kind of an open hand, they never really tightly grasped it or really understood it. The second thing that I would encourage that person to do is that they also need to deconstruct, if you will, the newfound faith that you have in yourself, in your own ability to determine what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. How much can you really trust yourself? How much faith should you put in yourself in determining what is true? Who gets to determine truth? Are you the person who determines truth? Now, I know that we live in a culture today where everybody has their own idea of truth. So people will say, well, this is my truth, and you have your truth. This is a very postmodern way of thinking, kind of late stage postmodern way of thinking that questions everything. And so in that kind of subjective questioning of everything, then it's kind of like, the question that was asked by Pontius Pilate to Jesus in the Gospel of John, what is truth? And so you've come to a determination about what is truth. But who gets to determine what is truth? Is there such a thing as objective truth? This comes into the whole philosophical discussion about what truth is and how you determine truth, the correspondence theory of truth, all these different sort of things. But is there an objective standard of truth, and are you the person who determines what is true? And if you say there is not an objective standard of truth, how do you or I assess whether or not that your belief that there is not an objective standard of truth is true? It's a valid thing to consider. So you need to deconstruct your own faith in yourself as it is to whether or not you have the capacity or ability or authority to determine what is true, what is good. When I say what is good, I'm talking about things moral, things that are right and wrong. Is there right and wrong? How sure are you that you are able and have the authority to determine what is truly right, wrong, good, true, or evil? Is what is right, wrong, good, evil the result of just your own ideas and tastes? Do you determine what is right and wrong just based on what you think is good, valuable, true, and so forth? In other words, in the same way, is truth subjective? Is morality subjective? And is that morality just your morality alone? And if it is, what real value does that morality have? Can anyone be the arbiter of just what is right and wrong on their own, or should there be some sort of objective measure of right and wrong? So as you're deconstructing what was a very loosely held faith in the first place being affected by the culture around you, you have to really consider how you come to the determinations about what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, aesthetically right and pleasing and good. Are there objective values for these things? And you should really think through that. So, as I said, there's two tracks, I think, of deconstruction. One today is the person who's losing their faith that was just lightly held, not very tightly grasped. They didn't really understand what they believed, why they believed it, how those things came about. So for them to lose their faith was not that big of a deal. But some people will call that deconstructed. I have deconstructed my faith. Well, you haven't really. You just kind of let it go somewhere along the line. So that's one kind of deconstruction. And that is happening. And that has happened for a very long time. There's another kind of deconstruction. And I proposed this to my friend the other day as kind of a hypothesis. I was asking him to weigh in. And this second kind of deconstruction, I think, is more concerning. It's more dangerous. I would even say it's possibly more insidious. And it is a deconstruction of a certain kind of faith in a certain theological paradigm or perspective. It is a deconstruction of a hyper-Calvinistic view. A hyper-Calvinistic view of God that holds to a strict, meticulous determinism, which, when it is run out to its logical conclusion, it leads one to discover that the God of hyper-Calvinism, the Yahweh, shall we say, of hyper-Calvinism, is ultimately not all that great. For lack of a better way of saying it, and I'm sure that this will get some unlikes on this, there's a certain theological construct, when carried out to its logical conclusion, causes a person to come to the place where they go, I don't like this God. He seems like a horrible being. He's more like the all-powerful Allah of Islam, who's all-powerful but not all-loving, than what I think would be the true representation of God in the Bible. And it is my contention, observing this over a number of years and now watching people deconstruct this kind of faith, that the strict 5-point Calvinistic systematic theology, when carried out to its logical conclusion, it leads to a place where God, by his sovereign direction, he determines everything, even the most horrendous and terrible possible things. The Yahweh of Calvinism, when carried out to the logical conclusion, and I know this is going to really bother some people who hold to a Calvinistic systematic, he is a moral monster. And I get it that the Calvinist who watches this will say, well, you just don't understand Calvinism. And I don't think that that is the case. I have studied the Bible and theology deeply and daily for 25 years, at least 25 years. I've been in vocational pastoral ministry for just shy of 25 years, almost 25 years. Next year will be 25 years. I have a graduate degree in theology. I have a Master of Divinity degree. I am currently completing a doctoral degree at one of the top seminaries in the world, which happens to be a predominantly Calvinistic seminary. I have read John Piper's books and listened to John Piper's studies, and I have read and listened to studies by R.C. Sproul. I've studied systematic theology. I have written on it. I have talked on it. I've studied historical theology and biblical theology. I've studied Calvinism, 5-point Calvinism, and even Piper's, what he would call 7-point Calvinism. I, for many years, went to John Piper's Desiring God conference in the dead of winter in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Why anybody would go to that place in the dead of winter in Minneapolis, Minnesota is strange to me, but I did. I have never been a Calvinist. I don't hold to 5-point Calvinism because I have always held that the logical conclusion, when you carry it out, when you really consider what Calvinism says about the sovereignty of God, a very meticulous determinism. You know, R.C. Sproul goes to the point of saying there is not a speck of dust in all the universe that is not exactly where it is unless it is placed there by the sovereign direction of God. And I don't believe that you can carry that thought out completely without ultimately recognizing that even the most hideous and heinous things that happen in the world and to individuals, true moral evil, malevolent evil, ultimately comes back to God. Now, I know the Calvinists will argue that point. They'll say, well, no, you just don't understand how these things work. Listen, I've studied what Calvinists say about this stuff. And that's where the logical conclusion goes. That's ultimately where it goes. And I wrote about this many years ago. I used to run a blog called crossconnection.net. And on the blog at one point in time, I remember I was on the Desiring God website, and it was right around the time of the year where you have Holocaust Remembrance Day. And John Piper had posted a post on there about remember what Hitler did. We cannot forget what Hitler did. And in the sidebar of that same post was a link to Piper's previous post where there had been a tornado that had gone through some community in the South and it had killed a number of people. And he was going through a theodicy from a systematic theological perspective on why do bad things happen. And he was making the conclusion in the previous post about the tornado that we have to recognize that this is God's doing. Ultimately, the Calvinist has to come to the point where they say, God did this. So here's my question. If you're going to conclude that this tornado, God allowed it, God did it, by his sovereign direction, there's not a speck of dust that exists in all the universe that is not meticulously determined or placed there by God. If you're going to determine that the tornado was done by God, then why, in the next post, will you say, we have to remember what Hitler did? Wouldn't we say that that was God's doing? Now, I get it. That's going to upset some people, but let's carry these things to their logical conclusion. So, this track of deconstruction that I think is more dangerous and concerning, insidious, is of a number of former Calvinists, generally roughly my age. I'm of the age, which if you back up 10, 12 years ago, there was this whole move in American evangelicalism of the young, restless, and reformed guys who were, very passionate about this sort of stuff. At the time, Mark Driscoll would have been among that group. Matt Chandler would have been among that group, or maybe even still is. Kevin DeYoung, go down the list of all these different guys who were in that vein. And I read a lot of their things and listened to a lot of their studies, never agreed with their Calvinistic perspectives because I could see where the logical conclusion of this goes. But a lot of people roughly my age, plus or minus a few years, have come to a place of deconstructing their Calvinistic faith because they come to the place where they begin to acknowledge and recognize that the horrible things that happen in the world, and maybe even some horrible things that have happened to these guys where they lose their marriage or they lose a child or they lose their own health or whatever it may be, they have to come back and say, well, God did this. And not just, losing your health, but really malevolent, evil things that happen in the world. And they come to a place of, maybe this God exists, but I don't want to be a part of his thing any longer. So they reject their faith. They lose their faith. They deconstruct. Or they completely walk away from faith entirely and say, well, God doesn't exist, because they just can't hold on to these two things at the same time. And I would say that if that is your situation right now, you are deconstructing your faith. You were formerly a Calvinist who now you've seen the logical conclusion of it. I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing to deconstruct that and to recognize that God, as he has revealed himself in the scripture, I don't think he's like that. I think you've been given a wrong understanding about who God is and what God is like. Now, if you are a Calvinist and you are angry at what I'm saying, I actually think that that's okay. I think that it's fine. You should wrestle with these things and really consider your faith. But I think you also should be angry that you have been given a false view of God that doesn't fit, I think, with what the scriptures really reveal. And maybe it needs to be a little bit deconstructed. So my advice to the person who's deconstructing their Calvinistic faith is don't throw everything away. Get to know God from the scriptures the way that he actually has revealed himself, not through the lens of 5-point or 7-point Calvinism. Deconstruct, that's systematic. I don't think that that's the best way to look at the scriptures. That theological view is worthy of some deconstruction. And I think that's probably where we're going. There's been some cycles of this in times past where kind of Calvinism bubbles back up to the surface until people realize where it actually leads logically. And then it kind of gets deconstructed, which maybe is not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to wrestle with these things. So just to summarize, I think there are two different tracks of deconstruction happening today. One is kind of a loose held faith where you don't really have deep convictions about it. It was just what you were raised in. And now the cultural trappings around you are more enticing than the Christian faith. And so it's like, well, I'll deconstruct this or just kind of let it go. You weren't holding on to it all that tight anyway. Losing your faith. Okay, that's fine. The other one is much more dangerous, and that is you have come to believe a wrong view about God. And what you really need to do is get to know God as he is revealed actually in the scriptures. And I'm very concerned, and have been concerned for a long time, that the Calvinistic systematic theological perspective misrepresents God as he has revealed himself in the scriptures. And I'm sure this is going to get some people angry. I might even get some angry comments from some angry Calvinists who are just manifesting the characteristic of God as they has been taught that he is, very angry. But maybe not the best way to think about him. And your old friends who used to be Calvinists, who are deconstructing their faith, maybe they're right to do so. So, God bless. Happy Thursday. I'm sure we will be back here at some point in the not too distant future. See you later.